Two quick points. I know a lot of constitutional history has been cited today, but just fact check. The American Community Survey began in 2005. Unless Thomas Jefferson figured out a way to text us some real key messages, this is not a constitutional issue. It is about how best to actually survey and acquire accurate, timely, reliable data in a way that the public supports. I think the vote on the House floor did exactly what I think it intended to do, which is jumpstart a long overdue discussion about how we modernize the data so that lawmakers can make better, not just both private enterprise and government lawmakers and legislative lawmakers have the ability to get the most reliable, accurate data. And I think that's what, frankly, this hearing's been helpful in discussing. Dr. Hall, from your perspective, what is the most economically significant gap in federal statistical data? In other words, without having adequate information in a specific area, obviously the decision-making suffers. What would that area be, in your view?
Yeah, there are a number of gaps. I still think it's probably our lack of detail in services.
On services, because yes. That is what, 80% of our economy, 80% of most of the jobs in our congressional district. Average salary these days of almost $60,000 a worker. So these are key, and we are very good at it when compared to the rest of the world. And your point, that major part of our economy, we're not accurately assessing?
Yeah, it's not nearly measured nearly as well as the goods sector. And I think there's a real element here of, there's an old joke about you lose your contact in the bedroom, but you look for it in the living room because the light's better there. It's easier to measure goods. It's harder to measure services. And only the past 10 years have we started to close the gap and measure services better, but we're not there yet.
Don't you think that's sort of a part of a helpful discussion we're having today, is to raise the profile of the gaps that we need to be closing in our economy and in our economic activity?
Absolutely.
Great. Mr. Adonis, you talked a bit again about the global supply chain. Can you give some examples of how the way the economy and business work today, where lawmakers miss the data as they're discussing or making key decisions on trade or other issues?
Well, sure, and I think you alluded to the largest one, which really is the idea that we don't know where value is created, and that the trade data that you see and is reported in our national income accounts doesn't reflect accurately what's being done in the global economy. So the best example are a series of studies at UC Irvine that looked at Apple's supply chain and where the value is created. And what it reflected, if I pulled out my iPhone, you would say about 65% of the value is made in the United States. Much of it is through manufacturing of the microprocessors, which are the brains behind everything that Apple does. Some of the glass finishes, but it's really the high end of what we manufacture and certainly what they do. Another large share of that remaining 35% is done variously in Southeast Asia or North Asia, in Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia, and roughly 8% comes off of the final assembly in China. And yet, when we get the statistics, that my phone is going to be counted as a product of China, because the rules of origin dictate that the point where it was, quote unquote, a new article of commerce was created is going to be associated with the origin of the country, and we keep the statistics based on the customs rules of origin. The customs rules of origin make absolutely no sense in the world we live in today. If you take it one step further, Vice Chairman Brady, if you think about where technology is created today, it doesn't matter whether the engineer is in the United States, in India, you can't locate where that's being created. So the idea that somehow we're going to have a geographic measure of the final good, and we're going to miss the more fundamental point, because remember, it's the innovation and the step change in technology and the process improvements on the shop floor that flow from that drive productivity and drive economic growth. So if you understand what I'm saying, is that we're not measuring how value is created, which is the most important thing to understand in terms of whether we're gaining productivity. And there's nothing about the trade statistics, particularly the endless debate about a trade deficit, actually informs your judgment about that.
Well, I think one of the key benefits would be most members of Congress are eager to create jobs. Most of them would prefer it happen in their state or district. when you don't know where that value is being added and you don't have a good idea of where your companies are selling and exporting goods or services in a way that can connect it, we're not going to make good decisions on economic issues.
And frankly, even the distinction between manufacturing and services in the jobs is something of a fiction. You know, we were at the high water mark of vertical integration with the Rouge plant in Detroit, where you had coal and iron going in one end and a Model T coming out the other end. That's been gone since the 1930s. The reality is that when, for example, Motorola decides to turn to FedEx or UPS to handle all of their logistics, all of their customs processing, those jobs that used to be manufacturing jobs when they were in Motorola are now services jobs in the rest of the economy. But the reality is Motorola as an enterprise became more competitive as a part of the process, and that's really what we need to be measuring. Did they gain their productivity through that? Does that make them more competitive globally?
Good. Thank you.
Mr. Mulvaney?